and on your own and implement those for different things. This is the reason that we have this in the curriculum is because higher order components are actually pretty well used in third-party libraries that you use a lot. For example, in Redux, there's some higher order components that you'll use all the time. And so if you don't know what a higher order component is and haven't seen how it's built and the structure of it, it can be really intimidating and confusing when you use third-party library higher order components. So the whole point of today's material is to expose you to higher order components, let you see the patterns and how they're used, and prepare you to use them in third-party libraries. So there's not any kind of expectation that you will learn these patterns to the point that you can go build them on your own. Just that to get you comfortable to use other higher order components that other people have written, if that makes sense. Using it is easy. Building them is a lot more difficult. But using them, like the Redux higher order components or React Router higher order components, that's the easy part. However, the syntax is a little bit confusing, so we're going to teach you what they are underneath and show you how to build them so that you can feel more comfortable using them in the future. So keep that in mind today. The afternoon project is difficult, kind of refactoring a little bit of your project to use a higher order component. If you're totally frustrated and feel like you don't understand HOCs at all by the end of the day, that's okay. That's kind of what we expect. So just take a little solace in that. So yeah. However, again, it is important to recognize higher order components when you see them and be able to use other higher order components that other people have written. Cool, so with that, let's go ahead and get started. So we're gonna start from in a replit here. And we're gonna start at the very basics, kind of build up to what a higher order component is and some of the somewhat confusing syntax of higher order components. So bear with me here. We're going to start very simple, very easy, but I feel like this is a really good way to kind of introduce this. So we're going to start with functions. Typing is hard. All right. Okay, so we've got functions in JavaScript, right? So we can say something like function number return 42. Okay, we feel very comfortable with this syntax. We know that if we call number, that we're going to have the number 42 returned to us. Similarly, writing a function this way is the same as writing a function like this. Okay, two functions that they're actually named the same and do the exact same thing. So these are essentially the exact same things here, right? Now this, we know with arrow functions, we can actually do implicit returns by removing our curly braces and removing the return keyword here. So both of those are going to be the same as something like this. Okay, all three of these are the exact same. Let's do, well, yeah, let's comment this out because we're gonna get some name spacing errors here. Okay, cool. Awesome. Now we're going to step it up a tiny bit. So let's do a function called person that takes in a name. Okay, and we're going to take that name. We're going to return an object with a property called name on it. And the value of that name property is going to be whatever name we pass in here. All right, so if we have this person function, this is going to be the same as writing something like const person equals name return object. Okay, with me so far? I'm going to make this one even a little bit more simple because we can do, there's a shortcut that we can do with objects that basically if you have a variable called, well, this variable is called name here, right? We've got this parameter that's come into our function. If the value is the same as the property name here, we can just shorten it and to this. So that's the same as, why do I keep doing that? Name. That doesn't really have anything to do with higher order components, just a little shortcut that I like to kind of talk about here. So what this is doing is we're returning an object that has a property name on it with the value of this name that's come in. So it's just a shortcut way to do that. All right, let's do this all in one line. Const person equals name arrow. Okay, so with this one, let's actually revert back to this for a second. So with this, if we want to make this an implicit return like we did up here, then we would think that we would have to just take away curly braces and the return keyword, right? And that looks like how we would build this one-line arrow function, but that's actually wrong. And the reason it's wrong in this case is because we're returning an object. These curly braces here are not the object curly braces. They're actually the function body curly braces that we deleted from here. So if our arrow function, so let's bring this, let's do, I will just leave that there. Let's bring this down here. So if we do something like this, these curly braces are actually acting as the function body curly braces. And now this is telling us that this is not valid syntax here. So if we want to implicitly return an object, we just need to wrap that object in parentheses. Now we've accomplished the same thing as both of these functions up here. All right, also just another little trick that I wanted to share, not really much to do with higher order components, but we're building up to that. So along the way, we might get a couple little tidbits like this. Okay, awesome. So the next part of this is, what if we want to pass in, we saw that we can pass in variables or values to functions, right? What if we want to pass in a function as a parameter? Ooh, that sounds kind of cool. So let's try this. Let's say functions as params. We're gonna have we're going to skip this part here. We're just going to jump into our arrow functions. Const execute. We're going to take in some function. And this execute function is going to execute the function that gets passed into it. Okay, so we're going to say some func invoke that function that we just passed in. All right, so if we have a function, let's console log, or let's call execute, and we're going to pass in a function that alerts us and says executed, there we go, exclamation point. Okay, so when we invoke execute and we pass in this callback function here, and then call that callback function, then by calling execute and passing this in, we should get this alert out. So let's run that. Stopping, please wait. Alert is not defined. Oh, rude. Because this is ES, or this is a node instance, not a browser instance. Let's try console logging. There we go, executed, yay. So we executed a function, just a callback function, right? And we could really pass any function into here. We could take this out, define it up here, say const logger equals that function that used to be inside here, right? This is exactly what was inside here. We could pass in logger and get the same result. All right, all right. What about this one? What if we want to return a function from a function? Ah. Okay, there we go. And this is where stuff is going to get crazy. This is where we can do some pretty cool things. So let's create a function called get1. All right, so here's a function, and I'm going to return a function that returns the number 1. Okay, so we've got an outer function that returns an inner function. So if we wanted to, we could say something like const inner equals that inner function there. Clean that up, and then return inner like that. We can do that. That inner is a function. We're going to return it out of there. However, a lot of times when we do this kind of pattern, we don't want to, we don't follow it this way. We don't create our inner function outside of our outer function. We just return an anonymous function out of this outer function. Okay, so let's break this down real quick into a, since we're using arrow functions, we can do some implicit returns here, right? So let's start with our inner function. So we're going to say that is the same as const get1 equals a function that returns a function. Okay, so here we are. With an arrow function, we can take away the curly braces, take away the return keyword, and we're just going to bring the 1 to the right of our arrow, like that. All right, so this inner function is a function, an anonymous function, that returns the number 1. But we can take this one step further and make this outer function a one-liner as well. So we're going to take away these curly braces. We're going to take away the return keyword, and we're going to bring this function up to this line here to the right of the arrow. Okay. So const get1 equals a function that returns what's to the right of it. Anything to the right of the arrow is what's being returned. So we want to return a function that returns the number 1. Doesn't that look crazy? Oh, weird stuff happening today. But this is a really cool pattern that arrow functions give us to go away from all of this typing and syntax to just this simple one-line function here. Now, what we need to keep in mind, this is really important. What we need to keep in mind with these kind of patterns is that when we see an arrow, when we see a one-line arrow function, whatever is to the right of the arrow is being returned by that function. Okay, so let me show you what I mean. Let's take this, let's take this get1 function down here. And if I call get1, what's going to be returned by calling get1? Yeah, we're going to, so there's a few things here. A couple people have said the number 1, some people have said a function, the get1 function. Let's look at this. So let's look at what the get1 function is. So right here is the get1 function. So what's to the right of this arrow? To the right of this arrow is an anonymous function that returns the number 1. So as Rory said, we're going to return this anonymous function that returns the number 1. So let's run that in the green. We'll see that we get that function. So yeah, my first intuition when I started learning these patterns was that we were going to get the number 1 returned out of this call, but we don't. This is just the first return. So we're going to actually return the anonymous function like that. So this is what's returned from this. Okay, so if this piece of code, if this JavaScript expression evaluates down to a function, then we should be able to call that function, right? We should be able to invoke that function. All right, watch this. I'm going to call that function. This is going to evaluate down to this. So I'm going to go ahead and call that function. Mind blown, right? Okay, so what is going to be returned from this? Yes, 1, exactly. This is a pattern called currying. We can curry function calls like this. So yeah, you're exactly right. If this JavaScript expression returns this function, then what's going to happen when we call this function? Well, what's to the right of the arrow? The number 1 is to the right of the arrow. So we are going to return the number 1. We'll see that in green right here. Now this, you could go crazy with this. And go as many levels deep as you want. So 1 function, 2, 3, 4, 5 functions. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yay, we got to the number 1. I don't know why you would do that, but I guess you could. Okay, so that's where we want to be. Now, why would we want to do this? This doesn't make sense in this simple example. So let's look at something that's a little bit more involved and get an idea of why we want, why would we ever do this, something like this? So the power of this currying idea comes in this first call right here. And let me show you what I mean. So let's build a function called multiply. And this is going to be a function that takes in a number, and it's going to return a function inside of it. Okay, the inner function is also going to take in a number, and then what the inner function returns is the product of those two numbers that we passed in. If you remember back from 5th, 6th, 7th grade, product is the result of multiplying two numbers together. I almost said sum, but it's the product. So this multiply function right here is a function that takes in a number and returns this inner function here. This inner function also takes a number and then returns the product of those two numbers that we've passed in. So let's curry this and see what's going to happen. And then we're going to look at a really cool pattern. We're going to say multiply, let's say 5 and 20. All right, so what are we expecting this to return? Not quite 520. 100, yes. Ooh, nice. Yay. If we wanted to, we could get to 520, right? We could say string x, I don't know. I don't want to try and concat those together. We don't have time for that. Okay, exactly right. We get 100. We can see that we're passing 5 in for x. So x is 5. 20 in for y. So 5 times 20 is 100. All right, let's back up to this part right here. What happens if I say const, or what happens if I do this? Multiply 5. What do I get from this function call? Ooh, nice, Donald. Yes. Love it. What Don said. I think you can always just defer to that. Yeah, a function that is going to return the product of 5 times whatever you pass into that function. So let's take this function here because we're calling multiply once. So when we call multiply that first time, what's to the right of the arrow? Remember, that's the important part with one-line arrow functions. What's to the right of the arrow? To the right of the arrow is this function right here. So I'm going to copy, paste, but we already have given x a value. So I can come here and say 5 here. We can run this, but it's just going to be the bracket function. It's not going to show us the structure here. Okay, now watch this. I'm going to take this principle that we just learned. I'm going to capture this variable or this returned value in a variable. All right, so I'm going to say const multiply by 5 equals this. So now I've taken what this returns and I've captured what this returns in a new variable. So now I have a function that takes in a number and multiplies it by 5. Let's see that in practice. Multiply by 5, 20. So if multiply by 5 is this function right here, when I pass in 20, you know what, we've already done 20 up here. Let's try 10, just so we make sure that it's correct in our console. So when I take multiply by 5, pass in the number 10, I should get 50 out of here. Yay, we got 50. Okay, what if I wanted to dynamically create a function that multiplies by 3? Well, all I have to do is say multiply by 3 equals what? How can I dynamically create a function that multiplies by 3? Yeah. Yes. Are you seeing how powerful this is? This is pretty cool, huh? I'll multiply, pass in 3. I'll multiply by 3, and let's pass in 40. I don't know. Should get 120 out of here. There we go. But wait, let's shuffle this around and let's bring multiply by 5 back down here at the bottom and make sure that doing these two calls right here doesn't mess up either of my functions. In fact, let's just do this. Let's go console.log so we can see both of them work. We're going to run that, and they both work great. Even though we called the same function here to create these dynamic functions. Okay, so let's take a look at this. We've got a function that returns a function, and so we can dynamically create new functions with some extended functionality, right? So we can create this multiply by 5 functions that has the extended functionality of multiplying numbers by 5. And then same with multiply by 3. So let's keep all this in mind. We're going to come back to this in just a second. Let's talk about real quick higher order functions. We discussed these a little bit back here where we were passing functions as parameters. Higher order functions are functions that take in a function as an argument. So something like map takes in a function as an argument, or .filter, reduce. There's lots of these higher order components or higher order functions that we can run on arrays or some that we can run on objects. Okay, this is a pretty common pattern that we're starting to get used to in JavaScript. So that brings us to higher order components. We're going to combine this idea that we can have a function that takes in a function, or functions that return functions. We're going to combine both of those, and we're going to call those functions components. So we're going to say that a higher order component is a component that takes in one or multiple components as an argument and returns a brand new component. We'll end it there. It returns a brand new component. The returned component is usually a carbon copy of the passed in component with some added functionality. Okay, so there's somewhat of a definition of higher order components. To give you a better idea of what higher components are used for, let me give you an example, a theoretical example. So there's actually two main reasons we use higher order components. The first reason is to take in, let's say you had 10 components that were all doing the same, all had the same logic built inside those 10 components. Now, in React, just the nature of composition, of component composition and how React is built, it's really hard to, almost impossible to share logic between components, especially class components, right? If you have some logic, especially if that logic relies on state in a class, but if you've got logic inside a component, it's really hard to take that logic and share it with another component. So let's say we've got 10 components that all have the same built-in logic. Since we can't share that logic between all 10 components, we have to write that logic 10 times. Well, that's not good, right? We learned from almost day one of JavaScript, of programming in general, to stay dry, to not repeat ourselves. But now we're in a situation where we've got 10 components that we've rewritten the same logic over and over and over and over again. So what a higher order component is generally used for, one of the main reasons, is to build a component that you can dynamically create a brand new components by passing in each of those 10 components. So we pass in those components one at a time, and we abstract that shared logic out of each of those components. We build that logic into our higher order component. We pass in each of those 10 components, and it will dynamically create 10 brand new components for us that all have the shared logic, that all have that logic. So we're passing in those 10 components, we're extending their functionality with that shared logic that we took out of those components, and we're essentially doing something like this. So we're passing in something into our component and capturing what that component returns in a new variable. Okay, you'll see that happen in the guided project today, but that's where we want to try and get our thinking to. The other use case is for dynamically rendering different components. So dynamic rendering different components based on some condition. Well, higher order components also help us to render one component or another based on some condition that we're going to test against. This is what you're going to do in your project today. You're going to build out a login page, and you're going to use local storage. So your login page will have a username and password. When you click login, you're going to set a user object into local storage. Your higher order component is going to check to see, your condition you're going to check is to see if that user object exists in local storage. And then it'll dynamically render either the login page if you're not logged in, or your posts page if you are logged in. So that's what we're going to work on today. We're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we're going to jump into Code Sandbox, and we're going to work on this kind of that first, the shared logic idea of higher order components, so we can see that. And then at the end of the lesson, we're going to build out some conditional rendering. That's going to be pretty similar to what you'll do in your project today. Okay, so keep in mind kind of this pattern here and the higher order function pattern here as we start to build out higher order components. All right, let's take a look at questions. In theory, you can take a functional component into a higher order component to get access to the React lifecycle. Let me think about that. Yeah, you could. If you're, just kidding. I'm gonna change my mind. No, you can't, because higher order components are actually, well, you know, let's take a look at this in a little bit. The higher order component itself is a function, so it's not a class, but you can return the returned component can be a class component. So you can return a class component. So you can pass in functional components and return class components. And so maybe the purpose of your higher order component is to take in functional components and extend their functionality by giving them access to React lifecycle methods. That's interesting. Hadn't thought of that one. I like it. All right, let's take a 5-minute break, and then we'll come back and jump into this stuff. I haven't found a solution for non-proprietary music, so we're gonna go with lo-fi one more day, and then I'll get that fixed. All right, come on back. Okay, let's go ahead and open up Code Sandbox. There's one more question that came in that I want to look at. And so this question says, aren't we doing this by extending React class or the React component in our classes? When I read this, I kind of thought of maybe this is being asked differently than I thought. Are we doing this by extending the React component in our classes? So no. Oh, let's see. A little bit, but this is different than saying extends React.component in our class components. I mean, we are getting additional functionality for our components. That's through inheritance, though. This is higher order components work through more of a functional programming paradigm where we're passing things into a function and then returning a new function out of it. And we can consider these higher order components. If you're familiar with functional programming, these functions that we're creating, these higher order component functions we're creating, could be considered pure functions because we will always get the same result, the same return value from passing in the same argument. So I guess in a lot of cases that's probably true, but there is probably the ability to rely on external things. So maybe not every case would be a pure function, but don't worry about that if you don't know those terms. Cool. So let's go ahead and jump into Code Sandbox and create a React sandbox here. And I'm going to give you this. Hey, knock that off. This is what we're going to be working on right now. Andy beat me to it. Spoiler alert, don't look at Andy's message there. Okay, let's do a live version. That's literally like exactly what we're going to build right now. Let's see, now I want to do this and this first. And then I can share that link. Okay, so what we want to do is, well, let's do this. We're going to start out pretty simple and kind of build into a higher order component situation because the syntax and following the flow of components and data is actually kind of tough. It's a whole nother level of abstraction beyond state and props. And so state and props is already hard. And then we abstract it one level further and it's like, oh, why? So we're going to start off kind of simple, and then I'll try to illustrate the flow of data and props and components as best as I can. But I can tell you right now it's going to be pretty confusing. So, all right, let's create a functional component called title. And title is going to take in props. And it's going to, well, yeah, we won't worry about props quite yet. It's just going to return this h1 header right here. Okay, so we've got our title component that is returning this h1, so we can replace this h1 with title. And we have our Hello Code Sandbox back up there. All right, so let's create a subtitle component. It's going to do the same thing, but instead, this is going to return this H2. And so up here, we're going to render subtitle. And there we go. Now we've got our title and subtitle being rendered in their own separate components. Okay, so what if, let's do this. Let's make these a little bit more dynamic. And we're going to take the text out of both of these, and we're going to pass the text in as props. So I'm going to give our title component some text of Hello Code Sandbox, and I'm going to render that here, props.text. All right, back to where we want to be. Let's do the same thing here and take this out. We're going to say text equals our text. So now in subtitle, we have props.text that we can render. And there we go. Okay, so take a minute to build this out and get caught up with this point right here. All right, so now we're going to take this and we're going to add some functionality to these two components. Again, this is a very simple use case and probably not what you would normally build a higher order component for. But of course, as with everything, as you're learning, it's much easier to learn with these simple cases, right? So just bear with me. Let's do const uppercase text equals props.text to uppercase. Like that. Then we're going to copy this here and paste it in there. Aha! Now we have our uppercase text going in here. Then we're going to do the same thing for subtitle. So we're literally going to copy and paste our logic into a new component. All right, we are intentionally breaking dry rules here. Now it would be, at first glance, you might look at these two components and say, well, why don't we just make a reusable component that takes in data dynamically, does this, and then we don't have to keep repeating ourselves here. There's one difference between these two components, and that is what they render here. So one is rendering an H1, the other is rendering an H2. So we can't really make these a single dynamic component because of that little difference there. And so that's why we're doing, Ali has it. Sorry. So we're going to, we have to make these two different components because of that little difference there. All right, so now we want to, we've got this repeated logic happening. So we want to abstract this out into a higher order component, pass these title components into our higher order component, and do this logic inside our higher order component. Okay, a couple things with higher order components. First, we never render higher order components in JSX. So because of that, we're actually going to name any higher order components with a lowercase letter. So we're going to call this with uppercase. So we're going to create a function here. We're going to call it with uppercase. With is a pretty common way to name higher order components. Not always, but that is a convention for this kind of flow. Okay, so we're going to have a function here that, let's see, what were some of our rules that we said? So a component that takes in one or multiple components as an argument. Okay, so let's go back here and let's pass in some component as an argument, and returns a brand new component. All right, so we're going to return an anonymous component out of this function here. So what does that look like? Well, whatever is to the right of our arrow is being returned, right? So we're going to do an implicit return here. So I'm going to take away my curly braces, and I'm going to return a component. So here's an anonymous functional component. Now, what do we want to do inside this functional component? Well, we know that this component is going to take in some props. So we can do this inside here. So we can take that out of these. And then what? Every component has to return some JSX, right? We have to render something and return some JSX. What do you think we're going to render out of this component here? Yeah, some component. This is close. This is close. For one instance of this, it is going to be title because that's what we're going to pass in here. But we're making this dynamic. So if we go back to this, some component is like the X variable here. So we can pass in, we can call this higher order component several times, pass in something different, and create a dynamic component that's a little bit different with each instance. So in one of these instances, we're going to pass in title. So yeah, at one point it is going to be title, but inside of where we're declaring this, we want to render some component. So the first time we do this, we're going to pass in title, and this will be title. The second time we do it, this will render subtitle. But we do that dynamically through this argument here. Okay, so we want to now take this uppercase text. Well, notice how we don't have uppercase text inside here anymore. We don't have this const uppercase text. Let's just turn this back into props.text. Props.text. Okay, so we're back to lowercase, right? Because when we render subtitle, or when we render title, the text component is this with lowercase text. When we pass title through our higher order component, title is still going to expect a prop called text. So we need to put that prop here, because remember at some point this is going to be title. And title expects a prop called text. So let's do that. We'll give the value of uppercase text to that text prop. All right, so now the final step here is this part right here. The returned component is usually a carbon copy of the passed in component with some added functionality, which is about right, right? So we've got this returned component is going to be a carbon copy of title with the uppercase text functionality extended onto title or subtitle. So now let's do this part. Let's call our function twice. We're going to call it once, pass in title. We're going to call it a second time, pass in subtitle. We're going to capture the value of those function calls into two separate variables, like this. So we'll say const question mark. That's not valid, but that's okay. We'll come back to that in a second. With uppercase, pass in title. Const with uppercase, pass in subtitle. What is being returned from this value, from this function call here? When we call with uppercase and pass in a function, what is returned from that function call? Not the higher order component. With uppercase is the higher order component. What's being returned out of our higher order component? Almost, not the component being passed in, not text in uppercase. Yeah, it's whatever component we passed in, right? So, oh, the mutated component, I like that, the mutated component. The component passes a prop with the extra functionality of our uppercase text. Nice. Yeah, it's our H1 or H2, depending on which one we're looking at. Okay, so when we pass in, let's look at this. When we pass in title here, then that replaces some comp with title, right? So when we do with uppercase, pass in title, this right here is exactly what's being returned from this function call. So what's to the right of the arrow? The right of the arrow is this anonymous function. So I can take, let's call this angry title and angry subtitle. So when I create const angry title and call with uppercase, it's the exact same as doing that. Okay, let's look at this component right here. This is a normal component right now. It's a component called angry title that takes in props, takes the text from that prop, uppercases it, renders title, and passes in uppercase text. Okay, we can do the same thing here, but instead of rendering title, we're going to render subtitle. So these are very easy to see and understand what's going on, right? Now, if we want, we could render our angry components. Angry sub title, there we go. And hey, we've got our all caps. But angry title and angry subtitle are not dry. We want to go back to using with uppercase to get this functionality. So let's change uppercase back to rendering some component. What happened? There we go. Okay. And let's change these back to actually calling our higher order component. Oh, look at that. Came through, it worked. Aha! Yes. I think this deserves one of these. It's working. It's working. Okay. Emoji storm on how you feel right now. Find the best emoji that explains. Yeah, that's a good one. That explains your current mental state of mind. Oh, this stuff is crazy. I love it. 8th dimensional chess. Yes. Oh, that's a new one. I haven't seen that one. Oof. These are great. Okay, we're going to take a 5-minute break. We're going to come back and try and draw out a little bit better what is happening here. Okay, so let me see if there's any questions. Would this be the same as passing children to components inside of JSX? Not quite. Children are kind of their own special thing. Yikes! I don't want to jump into children right away. If you want to see a good example of using children with this pattern, then just jump back up here to Andy's. This one right here, because this is what Andy wrote here is the same exact thing that we just wrote, but instead of passing uppercase text onto our passing component through props, he's passing it in as children. So if you'd like to, if you want to study a little bit more about props.children, this is the same exact thing as what we wrote here, except it uses children rather than our regular props that we've seen up to this point. So thanks for that example, Andy. That's perfect. All right, let's take a 5-er, and I'll see y'all back in a few minutes. Okay, come on back. All right, let's see if we can map this out a little bit here. So I'm going to close this down and let's see. Yeah, that should be good, like that. Okay, so we started out with title and subtitle here, right, where we were passing down the text and we were doing the uppercasing inside each component. We decided that we didn't want to repeat that code for uppercasing props.text. So instead, we built a higher order component to extend that functionality to title and subtitle. So now, what we've done with our higher order component is we're passing in our title and subtitle components down here, and we're capturing the returned component. So every higher order component is going to return a component from it. And we're capturing that returned component in these variables here. Now you'll notice that our higher order component is lowercase to help us make sure that we don't try and render that inside JSX. But the variables that we've created to capture the component returned out of our higher order component are uppercase, because those are the ones that we usually end up rendering. So keep that in mind. There are reasons that we're doing casing here. That's all on purpose. So we're taking this component that's returned out of with uppercase. We're capturing this component in angry title. So let's look at this component one more time just to see what's going on. So this is a component that takes in props. So angry title is expecting props.text. So angry title is being passed the text prop. Okay, so angry title props.text is being passed in. We take props.text, we uppercase it, and then we take that uppercase value and pass it as the text prop to some component here. So in this first case, some component is title. So when we render title, if you just replace some component with title right here, we render title and pass in a text prop. Well, let's go look at title. Title indeed renders a text prop. So if we just look at this one line right here, this might be a little bit easier to kind of wrap your mind around what's going on in this higher order component. Just replace some component with whatever we're passing in here. So the second time, replace this with subtitle. So we're rendering subtitle and passing in some uppercased text to props.text. So let's go look at what subtitle renders. Subtitle renders an H2 of that text prop that we're passing in. Okay, so maybe just this line will help you understand. So when we render angry subtitle, we pass in text, which gets passed in right here. We uppercase that text, we pass it through to subtitle, and we render that uppercased text right here. Let's build one more. So you'll have this example here. We're going to build one more higher order component that is going to do the conditional rendering, closer to what you're going to do in your afternoon project today. I'm just looking, I'm going to look through the list of questions to see if there's any that we want to talk about right now. So give me 1 second here. Okay. So let's take a look at these questions, and then we'll jump into, we'll start up our next one, and then we'll take a quick break and finish up. All right, so when you pass a component into the higher order component, it is not the normal component syntax. For example, you pass on title and not title. Yeah, great. That's a great question. So when we pass it in here, we're passing in the definition, the function definition. We're not trying to render title inside here. So yeah, that's a really good question. Thank you for bringing that up. How would you compartmentalize all this? Really, again, like I said, this is not, I don't expect us to be able to take this lesson and start building our own higher order components right away, right? That's not the point of the content today. The point of the content is to prepare you for very shortly some higher order components that you're going to see and get you used to pretty much this syntax here. Okay, so what you're going to be implementing most of the time with higher order components is you're going to build out a component, pass it into some higher order component, and then render or export the returned component. So you don't have to do all of this part, but I do want you to at least have an inkling of an idea, not even like a good understanding, but just like some idea that, hey, this is a higher order component. Cool. That means that it's returning a brand new component. That's what I'm going to render. Okay, so that's mostly where I want you to be right now. As far as like compartmentalizing all of this, it's really going to take a lot of repetition and practice, even to get to the point that you could compartmentalize it all. So sorry I don't have a better answer for that. Yep, we're going to talk about that in the next little code sandbox that we look at. So never fear, we will cover it. On with uppercase, why do we need 2 arrow functions? Would it not be enough with just 1 arrow function? And I'm also getting confused on which arrow function is doing what. Yeah, let's look at that. Why do we have 2? And why can't we just have 1? We have 2 because of this concept right here. So if we step away from React and components and we just look at this multiply function, think about what multiply gives us the power to do through these examples down here. Multiply gives us the power to dynamically create functions that multiply by different numbers. So we easily could have done something like this and then repeated basically the same logic here. And that would get us the same results for these, right? But that's a lot more typing that we have to do. If we wanted to build 30 of these multiply by functions, we'd have to repeat this code over and over and over again. So what multiply does is it gives us the ability to, on the fly, dynamically create functions by calling multiply and passing in a number. Same with higher order components. Higher order components give us the ability to dynamically create components. So this second arrow function, don't think of it as an arrow function, think of it as a component. Okay, this is, I want you to get I don't want you to think about this as a double arrow function. I want you to think about this as a function that returns a component. Okay, that's why we have two arrow functions. Look at these components up here. We don't call these functions in React, right? We may call them function components, but we don't call them functions. We call these components. Same with this right here. If we were to pull this out into its own const component equals that, is that a, oh, bad play. If we were to do that, then we would recognize this as a component. But just like functions can be anonymous, function components can be anonymous, even class components can be anonymous. So just think of this more as an anonymous component, not a function. So why the double arrow? That's the first reason. The second reason is with upper class gives us the ability to, on the fly, create brand new components, dynamically creating components. So that's why we have the double return. We could, as I mentioned earlier, multiply. We could break this up, not do the double arrow, double function return thing. We could just make a whole bunch of functions explicitly, not dynamically, and not have to do this double arrow stuff. But this double arrow stuff gives us the ability to create things dynamically on the fly. So that's what we're doing with higher order components. Great question. I'm going to push this through and then just comment and lament. I was following along until you just did that. Okay, then forget what I just did and go back to where you were following along before. Sorry, a lot of this is going to be like, oh, I get it. Oh, and then he just did that. So I get it. This stuff is really hard. Again, keep in mind the framing that I talked about at the beginning. Okay, so we got that one. When you build out a higher order component, do you build it out the long way and gradually replace code once built out? Me personally, no. I can see that I'm trying to get to this point, and so I can build out a higher order component without going through those steps. I actually think it would probably even be harder to go through those steps every time and think through that process. That's more thinking that you have to do on it. So that's probably harder. But yeah, generally, if I'm gonna go build a higher order component, I can build out the higher order component first and be able to use that. Can you give an example when you would use higher order components in a real project? Yeah, so again, the two examples are conditional rendering, which we're about to see after our next break. And then the other one is for extending functionality. So anytime you've got some kind of functionality that's repeated between multiple components that you can't share easily between multiple components, that's when you'll use a higher order component. So for example, logging state, or maybe setting our current state to local storage so that you can refresh the page but keep the state that has been created. If you want to do that in multiple components, you can't share that. That would be impossible to share between multiple class components. So you could write a higher order component that keeps track of your state in local storage. Let's see. We'll see some examples in the next couple weeks. We'll see, I think, 3 really good examples in the next few weeks here. You can also do a search online to see about use cases for higher order components. But yeah, that's what I can come up with right now. Okay. I won't be able to do this in the time that we have remaining because we've got to go see our conditional rendering, but we will build one more code sandbox real quick, and then hopefully that helps with one more example. I'm really confused on how title is passing inside with uppercase title, and then where it goes from there. Yeah, let's look at that one last time before we take our last break. Okay, so title's being passed in here, right? So where does title go? Well, let's look at with uppercase. We're invoking, with uppercase is a function that we're invoking one time, and we're passing in title. So here's our with uppercase function. So when we pass in title, this is just an argument, right? Some comp, this is just a parameter. So when we pass in title, that comes in right there. So when this gets the value of title, then some comp down here in the return also receives that value. So what happens is when we call with uppercase and pass in title, it's the same as doing this. So then we capture, when we call with uppercase and pass in title, what is to the right of that arrow? Here's the function. What's to the right of that arrow? This right here. So this is going to evaluate, this function call is going to evaluate down to this code right here. So let me go like this. Let me copy this and replace all of this with that returned value. So angry title is a component that takes in props, looks at the text prop, uppercases it, and renders title. So when we render angry title, what we're doing is we're rendering title with this text uppercased. So let me do that and keep angry title here with uppercase, pass in title. And then we can do the same with angry title. We can say angry title is invoking with uppercase. We're passing in subtitle now, right? So we're passing in subtitle. So this becomes subtitle. So we look at with uppercase. We're invoking this function. What's to the right of this function? This returned component. So let's replace this with that. And that's what angry subtitle is. It's a function that takes in props, uppercases the text prop, passes that into subtitle. Subtitle renders that text in an H2. All right. I think if we keep walking around or walking through this, it'll just get more convoluted in our minds. So let's take a break. We'll come back and do the last example. And again, if this is just if this just totally confuses and frustrates you this afternoon, don't worry. Don't put too much stake into higher order components. In a couple weeks, when you see this pattern in Redux, you'll be like, oh yeah, I get it. Even if building it is really confusing. So Okay. We'll go ahead and take a break, and we'll come back. This is an interesting question. Do you have a simple yet realistic use case for higher order components? Not really, because higher order components are for very complicated situations. So let me see if I can find a list of examples that you can, if you'd like to see those examples, you can search through that. And yeah, again, that's a really tough ask because these are just complicated situations to begin with, which is why we're abstracting them with this pattern. So, all right, I'll see you back in 5 minutes. Okay, let's finish this up. Whew. All right. Oh, this is the best ever. Let's see. Do you give out aspirin with your higher order components lecture? I mean, we totally should. Oh, thank you. Yep, we will be using HOCs for our, not for our form, but I'll show you kind of how we're going to use a higher order component in the project this afternoon. So we're going to go through that right now. Okay, let's see. I need, let's see. Okay, perfect. So I'm going to bring this one over here, and I'll give you this. And we'll go live, so I can shut off this live one here. And we'll go live with this one. And do those things, and there we go. Okay. I need that. Perfect. All right, so let's take a look at what we have here in this project. So we've got our app component here with some state. So right now is logged in is false. And we've got a button that says toggle, and this dot toggle show first. Let's just call that this dot toggle. Okay, so that button takes in an event, and we're going to call prevent default on it like that. Okay, then we've got two components that we're importing here. So let's go to our component list. We've got first, and our first component basically just says, hi, I'm the first component. Our second component says, hi, I'm the second component. So let's do this. Let's just render our first component here. Hi, I'm the first component. Okay, so what we want to accomplish is we want to click this button and toggle this to show second, and back and forth like that every time we click the button. Woo. So we're going to do that with this higher order component called with conditional render. So we're going to build a component here. Now, even though this higher order component doesn't get rendered to the screen, it's still a component. We're going to start with, come on. I'm afraid I can't do the live session. What? I'm the owner, but I'm not allowed to. All right. Index, copy, refresh. I think I can't do the live session right now. Looks like it's going to give me some issues. Sorry. I will try to remember to save along the way. So if I'm not saving, then ping me and say, hey, save your files. So you can refresh along the way here. All right, so again, we need to import React from React. And we're going to build a function called with conditional render. And this is going to be a function that returns something. We're not sure what this is going to return yet. So we know that we want to return some kind of component out of this, right? So let's take a look at doing this with a class component. So we're going to return a class component out of here. Let's say extends react.component. Isn't that interesting? An anonymous class component being returned from this function. Cool. So it's a class component, so it's got a render function, right? And inside our render function, we're going to return something, some JSX out of here. Well, we know we're going to take in a function, a component, right? So let's go ahead and take in our first component. We'll call this first comp so we don't get the names confused. So we're going to take in first component here. And to start out, let's go ahead and just return first comp being rendered. Then we're going to export default with conditional render. Okay, let's go import this into our index. We'll call it once and pass in first comp. And we should see our first component rendering up here. Okay, so we're going to try and mimic this, what we see right now, with this higher order component. Okay, that file is saved. Let me go to index. I'm going to import with conditional render from /components / with conditional render. And I'll just bring that out a little bit. There we go. Okay, so instead of just rendering this here, we want to render our dynamically created component, right? We want to render this class component that's being returned from with conditional render. That's going to render whatever component we pass into it. So let's go back up here and let's create. We're going to say const. What do we want to call this? Const showing? No, const. Well, for now, let's just call this dynamic component. And let's call with conditional render. And let's pass in first. Okay, again, what does with conditional render return, right? We're calling a function. We need to think about what this returns. That's why we went through so many times what function calls we're returning. We need to be thinking about that with higher order components. What does this return? What is this capturing? What is the value of dynamic component? The value is this class component right here. So if I pass in first, then dynamic component becomes a class that renders first. Okay, so let's take that idea. So dynamic component is a class component that renders first. So we're going to say we're going to render dynamic component, and there we go. We're rendering first. If I were to pass second into here, then dynamic component would render second. And there we go, rendering the second component. So let's take that idea and let's extend this out. Let's say, let's pass in one more component here, like this. And let's make this dynamic component. We're going to call this a second time. We're going to curry these function calls. And now dynamic component is going to render whichever component is passed in this first call. But the important part here is that this class component now has access to both our first component and our second component. Okay, so we're going to pause there with our HOC. We're going to do some local storage stuff inside our toggle here. And we're going to make it so that with conditional render is going to toggle between first and second depending on what's in local storage. Okay, so our state right now is that well, let's do this. Let's do this.state.show first is true. So we want to show our first component here. So we're going to say every time we toggle, every time we click this button to toggle, we're first going to check if show first is true. So if show first is true, we're going to be showing our first component. Then we're going to, this.state.show first. If that's true, then we want to set our state. This.set state, there we go. We want to say show first is false. Else this.set state show first is true. Here we go. All right, so every time we toggle this, our state is being toggled from true to false, back to true, back to false, so on and so forth. Okay, so, but we want to tell our dynamic component, or we're gonna build local storage into this. So instead of checking to see if show first is true, we're gonna check to see if we have a show first property on local storage. So the way local storage works is you can just call the local storage API right here. For most browsers, there's some older browsers that you can't do this on. And so if you're ever working with local storage and you have to support some of those older browsers, then you have to check to see if local storage is a thing, and if it's not, then don't do what you're trying to do with local storage. However, most of you should be on pretty current browsers, and so you shouldn't have a problem just running local storage functions here. So there are a few methods that we have on this local storage object. One is called getItem, where we can check to see if we have something with a specific property name in local storage. So we're just going to call this show first. If there is something in local storage called show first, then that means show first is true, and we're trying to toggle it. So we're going to switch our state to false, and we're going to say local storage set item, and we're going to call the set item function. Okay, so we've got get item, we've got set item. Actually, sorry, we're going to remove item. We're going to take away show first. so it's no longer there. Okay, but if it's there, we're going to remove it, and we're going to set our state to false. If it's not there, then we want to set local storage. We're going to say .set item, and this one takes in two arguments. The first is we're trying to set a new key value pair in local storage. But this doesn't work quite like objects. We first pass in the key name and then the value. So we're going to say show first is true. So when we run local storage.set item, pass in two values, let's go see what exactly that creates in local storage. Okay, so to check local storage, open up your DevTools, go to Application, the Application tab, and here you have all of your browser storage options. So local storage, session storage, that's hard to say after today's lesson, indexed, DB, cookies, these are all different storage solutions that live inside your browser. They're mini databases that you can take advantage of inside your browser. So we're going to open local storage. We're going to click on this right here. Okay, that was just a test value. We don't really have anything inside here yet. So when we click toggle, we get a new value added to local storage. Okay, so here's our key and our value pair. Now, next time we click toggle and we go through this if statement, we're going to see if get item returns something. And if it returns something, then we're going to remove that item out of local storage and set our state to false. So I'm going to click it again, and it removes it. Okay, so this is pretty similar to what you're going to be doing today. When you're going to have a login form. When your user, when you log in, you're going to set a user item. So just like keyword user and value true. It doesn't really matter. You could do like your username and password combination. That's fine. However you want to do that. You're going to set some key value pair here to local storage. Then what's going to happen is your higher order component is going to check to see if that item exists inside local storage. And if it does, it'll show the post page. It means you're logged in and it'll show the post page. If it doesn't exist, it'll show the login page. So that means you're not logged in. So let's go build that into our with conditional render here. Okay, so instead of just rendering our first component, let's say we only want to render our first component if local storage.get item show first is true. So if there's any key value pair called show first, then we're going to return our first component. If there's not a key value pair called show first, then we're going to render our second component. All right, so inside your higher order component, you're going to either return your first component that you passed in or your second component that you passed in. So let's go back to index and remember where these two things are coming from. So in index, when we create dynamic component here, we call with conditional render, pass in first and second. That passes in our first and second component to first comp and second comp. Then our higher order component is going to check to see, is going to do some kind of logic check. And based on this logic check is going to render one or the other component. Okay, so let's go test this out. Hey-oh, there we go. So when I have show first inside my local storage, first component is rendered. If I don't have that in local storage, second component is rendered. Now let's take a look at the README for today, because just doing this walkthrough one time isn't going to help you very much be able to implement this in your project. We understand that. That's why the README for today in the tasks takes you through pretty well step by step what you need to do. Okay, so there are tons of bullet points for how to accomplish this project today. So my caution for you today in your afternoon project is to make sure you're going bullet point by bullet point and making sure that you accomplish everything in that bullet point before you move on, and just really stick to this README and stick to these instructions, because it's going to walk you through pretty directly, even with code examples here, how to accomplish this in your project. I would also caution you not to focus on the solution branch at all. If you focus on the solution branch, you're just hurting yourself. You're not going to learn. Go through the instructions. Take your time, one step at a time, one bullet point at a time, and just remember, keep in mind the framing for today, that this is not expected. You're not expected to learn these principles. We just want you to understand and have a little bit of practice with the pattern so you recognize it in the future. Okay? Whew. All right. There we go. Let's see if there's any questions. I'm scared to slide over. Just kidding. See if there's any questions. Yeah, we didn't really talk about this, so just a heads up. If for today's lesson, you're not going to be reading values from local storage, you're just going to see if something there exists. But in the near future, you may want to actually set like an object here and read that value at a later time. So just a heads up, when you're using local storage, let's just do this. We can show this real quick. So instead of setting a Boolean of true, let's set an object is logged in true. Watch what happens when I send an object to local storage. I get the string version of a JavaScript object. So what happens here is this just reads JSON strings. Okay, so it takes what we pass in here, stringifies it, and when you stringify, when you turn an object into a string in JavaScript, this is the result. So if I did that and then I went to get this item, I would literally get this string, this weird string here. So great point. When we set to local storage, we want to stringify. I always get these backwards. So let's try this. When we set to local storage, we want to do json.stringify. So we can just, well, let's just close this. Get out of here. Okay, so when you, inside your set item, the value, if it's not a string, you want to json.stringify it and pass in your object or array or whatever you're passing in. So now when we do that, then we get our actual object here. And then if you wanted to use that value somewhere, like when you say get item, you have to wrap your get item in a function called json.parse. Then you could get the actual object back out of local storage. So again, if you want to actually store meaningful things inside here, objects, arrays, numbers, something else, keep in mind that you need to stringify it as it goes in and parse it as it comes out. Thank you for sharing that. I was debating whether or not to talk about it, but I'm glad we did. Okay, what is the difference between local storage and state? State is a kind of a temporary state of your data inside your component. So state just lives here inside your component, right? In your code, we're caching, or we're setting show first to true, and then we kind of toggle it back and forth with these set state calls. By the way, the reason we're toggling set state is to trigger this component to re-render, so that dynamic component re-renders, so that we do this check again. If we didn't run set state, render wouldn't run again, and we would never see this toggle back and forth. Anyway, so yes, state is just an object that lives right here in your code. So every time you refresh the page, this is going to reset to true. Local storage is a mini database that lives in your browser. So if we were to, let's do this. We're going to keep this value here, and I'm going to refresh the page. And you can see that my value stays, it persists. I could even close this down and open it back up. Maybe I can't. Where are you at? There it is. Go into application, go into local storage, and it persists even from closing your browser down. So local storage is a little database that helps you persist data beyond refreshes and closing down your browser. State is local just to that component. So when you refresh the browser, your state is going to reset and reinitialize. Okay, great question. All right, have a wonderful day, everyone. Thanks for sticking through a tough lesson. Thanks in advance for sticking through a tough afternoon. Tomorrow, push through today, because tomorrow's like the most relaxing, kind of fun, easy day that you've had in a long time. So I look forward to tomorrow and just kind of having fun and being way more relaxed and easier than higher order components. All right, I'll see y'all tomorrow. Thanks.